Welcome back, everyone. This is, I think, the second or third iPad that I actually went ahead and reviewed this year. So shout out to that and shout out to you guys for supporting, I guess, I don't know, some corny stuff like that. But we're going to go ahead and see how the original iPad mini holds up in 2021. Now, what's very interesting about this specific timeline is that the iPad mini 6 is set to be released sometime soon. I'm not really too sure exactly when it's going to be coming out, but I will tell you, first of all, the iPad mini surprisingly isn't bad. I still think it actually holds up fairly well for being, as old as it is. It came out originally in 2012, which is insane. Now, I probably would not recommend picking up this 9-year-old iPad at this point, but I'll go ahead and leave some other iPads that I'll probably recommend throughout this year in the description below, so you can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the front of the iPad mini, you can see that we do still have that 7.9-inch display, and one thing that can make you feel a little bit better about owning this iPad is the fact that the screen size has pretty much stayed the same from this iPad screen to the newer ones. However, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the same display. The newer ones are the Retina panels with the higher PPI and all that stuff. So this panel is pretty outdated when it comes down to it, but it's not a bad panel by any means. And I actually think it looks pretty good still. Now, there's a lot of bezel around the panel for today's standards. You have quite a bit of bezel on the top and obviously the home button and all that stuff. But I think considering the fact of how old this iPad is, it's not ugly looking. And I think this was actually one of the first iPads to bring kind of the slimmer bezels on the side. So that was another pretty big asset for it for sure. So when it came down to the front, it's pretty outdated, but it's kind of what we expected. We still have that lightning port on the bottom of this iPad as well. And I don't know if this was the first iPad to bring a lightning port. That may have been the iPad 4, but this iPad came out the same year as the iPhone 5. So it's pretty cool that this thing also had that type of capability at that time back in 2012. And on the back, we have the aluminum build on this device still. Nothing has really changed there. It's pretty much exactly the same thing. And one of the best things about this iPad is just how premium this thing still feels. When you look at all the other iPads that have came out, yes, the newer ones feel better for sure. I mean, the iPad Pro 4th generation definitely feels like a far better and just, better performing iPad than the iPad mini 1. But they don't feel too much off, and I think the iPad mini 1 still feels pretty good for the most part. So in terms of the outside, that pretty much covers it up. But on top of the aluminum back, we do have that single camera setup, which I'll go ahead and hit on right now. And I'll definitely tell you right now, it's not a good camera, but I guess at that point it was okay because you had cameras on this thing first of all. So you had that 5 megapixel camera on the back. It's a single sensor. Basically every single iPad except the iPad Pro 4th generation has a single sensor. So it's totally okay. It's not a big deal. You can only do 1080p video on it, which in my opinion at that time for an iPad is actually a pretty decent, resolution to film at. I don't think it's necessarily perfect, but it is actually pretty okay for the most part. So that actually kind of threw me off. I wasn't expecting it to have a 1080p sensor just right there. Now, you don't really have too many capability when it comes down to it. I mean, it's pretty basic. You don't have an insane amount of, features. You may be able to download some, features in the App Store or some apps in the App Store that can go ahead and kind of fill in the void in some ways. But I'll definitely tell you, it's really not that great of a camera setup anymore. It's very glitchy. The UI is very slow as well. That has a lot to do with, the chipset inside of it. But the fact that this thing has a camera in it at all is a pretty good thing in my opinion. And the fact that it also came out 9 years ago and it still functions is a pretty awesome thing too. So in terms of the camera setup on the back, it's definitely okay. In the front with that 1.2 megapixel sensor, I mean, you can do 720p videos on that thing. And again, more so than just, filming videos on the front and all that stuff. It's just the fact that this thing had the capability of having FaceTime and all that stuff on this type of camera is something that's really awesome to me. Of course, if it had, 4K on the front and the back, that'd be different. But I think it's totally okay for it being 9 years old. It totally makes sense to me. So in terms of the camera setup, that pretty much covers it up. Now, software wise, this thing did originally come out with iOS 6. You were able to upgrade it to iOS 9.3.5. I wish it did. I mean, if this thing got like iOS 11 or something, I guess it wouldn't really matter too much. It is pretty outdated in today's standards, considering we are now on iOS 14, and the fact that iOS 15 is going to be coming out in a couple of months in a beta form. This thing is pretty outdated when it comes down to software. The software is doesn't really have too much going for it anymore. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad piece of software. I think iOS 9 was actually pretty good, but you don't really have too many features when it comes down to it, to be completely honest. And this was before iPadOS, 13, and this was before iOS 11 as well. because iOS 11 was pretty important, even though it was kind of weird. It was always pretty good on the iPads, to be honest, and this thing didn't get that, unfortunately. But I think, you can still get software updates through the App Store for a lot of the apps out there, so it's not really like a horrible thing, but I wish it did have a little bit more capability in the software. But in terms of that pretty much covers it up. Now, performance-wise, this thing does have the Apple A5 chip inside of it, a dual-core CPU with 512 megabytes of RAM. So keep that in mind. This thing has half a gig of RAM, which is insane to me. I mean, there's probably a lot of like AirPods probably have more RAM than that. No, I'm totally joking, but there's probably a lot of devices out there that have way more RAM than this that are in like random accessories. And the fact that this thing doesn't even have, 1 gig of RAM is pretty insane. But again, it's a 9-year-old device. It's what we expect at this point. Now, what I can tell you is about this type of device is that, first of all, I think it's still actually pretty cool, the fact that this thing still turns on and it still has some capability when it comes down to the performance segment. This is a 9-year-old device, and there's a lot of 9-year-old devices probably back when this thing came out that weren't even really worth it. Nobody was talking about, and it wasn't even like any much to talk about at all. We didn't even have iPads 9 years when this thing came before, and I think the fact that this thing is still even somewhat relatable, or the fact that people are still even searching up this video, is pretty insane to me, because it just goes to show how much more technology there is in the world now than there was even like just a couple of years ago, which is so insane. And I think the performance of this thing is justified in that specific sense because it is a 9-year-old device. It isn't really competing with, today's tablets or today's iPads. It's competing with iPads and tablets from 9 years ago. And where do those things stack up now? You know what I mean? Especially in the tablet form. I mean, we had a lot of Android tablets at that time. Where are they at now? You know what I mean? There's not really a lot, which is so crazy to me. So I think when it comes down to the performance, it's pretty slow. I don't think anybody's really going to go ahead and combat that. But the fact that this thing still turns on, the fact that it still has some capability in that sense is pretty insane to me when it comes down to it. So in terms of the performance, that pretty much covers it up. Now, hitting on the battery life and ending it off with that, this thing at that time actually had a pretty big battery size. It was a 4,490 milliamp hour battery. And I don't think it's like a humongous battery in this day and age, considering we do have like, phones that have bigger size batteries than this. But at that time, having something over 4,000 milliamp hours, I can only imagine was pretty insane. There were a lot of iPhones that only had like a 1,500 milliamp hour battery, something like that. And the fact that this thing had that big of a size battery for an iPad, which wasn't even super powerful, which had a pretty low resolution display, was a pretty big deal in my opinion. So in terms of the battery life, that pretty much covers it up. And to kind of sum up the video and to answer the question, should you go ahead and pick up an iPad mini 1 in 2021? Well, what I'll tell you is this. I don't think this iPad is necessarily worth it or not worth it. I mean, it definitely isn't worth it to buy in terms of actually using it as a main iPad. I think, a lot of iPads have gone down in value so much that if you were to pick up this thing, you'd probably still end up paying like $50, $60 for it, where you can pick up like an iPad 7th gen or a 6th gen probably, which would be way better than this, even a 5th gen iPad for like $100 something. And that is definitely a much better deal in my opinion than this specific iPad. So I think it's only worth it in the sense if you need something that like you need a display to kind of display things on, if you want to use an iPad to basically, play videos on or something like that, this is not a bad iPad for that. If you need something just to basically stream things or whatever, this will definitely handle it. I think the RAM is probably the biggest, differentiating factor though, because this thing even has less RAM than an iPhone 5, which is pretty crazy to me too. So you're not really getting a lot of power. You're not getting a lot of anything. I think the display, which isn't even a Retina display, is probably one of its biggest assets. So that's kind of a major thing that I would kind of say in that specific sense. But I think for every other aspect of this iPad, it kind of holds a legendary status in a way. Not necessarily as big as something maybe like the iPad 8th generation, in my opinion. That's a pretty legendary tablet. Maybe not even more so like an iPad Air 2. That's pretty legendary. This iPad holds something a little bit different because it's not really a collector's item anymore. But the fact that this was a smaller iPad at that time and a smaller just tablet really showed that a lot of people wanted some type of smaller device. And I think in a way this also kept Apple kind of making those smaller, iPhones as well, because people just liked having options. And by people having the option of either picking up a bigger iPad or a smaller iPad and not really sacrificing on too much in the middle is something that was pretty crazy. And Apple still does it with their, 12.9 inch iPads, their 11 inch iPads, and then their 10.5 inch iPad Air 4, iPad Air 3 and then the iPad Air 4 and all this stuff. Like, there's a huge range, and I'm really glad that the iPad mini was still around, and I'm glad we're still getting potentially another iPad mini as well. So I guess we'll see what happens, but that really pretty much covers it up for the most part. Like I said, if you guys want to pick up some other iPads that I would probably pick up this year, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. But that's really pretty much it. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.